My name is Gah-Kai Leung. I am a student of Philosophy, Politics and Economics at the University of Warwick. I'm talking this morning to Michael Scott, who is Assistant Professor of Classics and Ancient History, also at the University of Warwick. So Michael, how did you get into classics to start with?
I was never going to be a classicist. When I grew up, I was going to be a doctor, and I went into a hospital for a day and sort of followed around some doctors, officially, of course, and that proved to be a disaster. Couldn't stand it. Then I was going to be a lawyer, and that was my plan right up until probably around 2 weeks before UCAS submission deadlines, when I suddenly thought, ooh, do I want to be doing a subject at university that I might well be doing in a job for the rest of my life? And if I didn't want to do that, what do I want to do? And we had just been to Greece on the school trip to Greece. I was doing Greek A-level, and basically I had my 17th birthday while we were there in Greece.
Oh, wow.
Some very memorable times, which should not be spoken. I basically decided at that point that I wanted to do classics. To do that, it meant I had to take a gap year because I had given up Latin ages before, and at that stage really you needed to kind of have Latin. Greek was an option, but if you didn't have Latin, the university departments didn't really know what to do with you. So I took a gap year and relearnt Latin as part of the gap year, and then applied and then read classics as an undergrad. And I was always going to go and do law afterwards until basically the summer of my second year of undergrad, when I did a law internship at a big London law firm that shall remain nameless, and I did a 2.5-week summer school at the British Archaeological School in Rome. And sort of between those two, it became very clear that I wanted to do classics.
I see. Was Greece always your passion to start with? I mean, you said that you had Greek A-level, but then you had to relearn Latin.
Yeah, I mean, so much of this depends on how you get on with your teachers and how your teachers teach at school, I think, particularly for subjects like Latin and Greek, which, they're dead languages at the end of the day. So the interest comes from how they're taught, what they open up for you, or what the teachers help you realise the languages can do for you in opening up interesting worlds. And Latin I just never got on with, didn't get on with the teachers, didn't get on with the language. Greek I absolutely loved and adored, partly because I think I came to it later, and partly because I think the teachers were really good. And so fell in love with ancient Greek, and as a result Greek language and culture. But during my undergrad degree I did both, so I relearnt Latin. I was doing Latin and Roman history and Greek, so the whole classics package. And it wasn't until my third year of undergrad that I had to pick a dissertation topic, and decided to do a Greek topic for that, and basically had a fantastic time working with the supervisor that I was allocated. Decided to stay on for an MPhil and very much wanted to work with them. And as part of that course that was Greek focused, I went to live in Greece and work at the British School of Athens, the British Archaeological School in Athens, as part of a 2.5-month postgrad course that they ran. So, as a result of that, 2.5 months spent in the landscape, in the sites, working with the experts, seeing the archaeology at first hand. I never looked back, and Greece was always my focus from then on.
Cool. And how did you get to Warwick?
So I started here at Warwick as an assistant professor in October 2012. And I had done my undergrad, MPhil, PhD and research fellowship all at Cambridge up to that stage. So I've been in Cambridge for over a decade, and I was applying for jobs, permanent positions in different places, and a job came up at Warwick. I applied, came up here, and I was pretty much instantaneously bowled over by the friendly nature of the campus, and by the sort of the relaxed atmosphere, both here in the Department of Classics and sort of more generally around the campus. Applied, had to go through the interview process, and somewhere along the line someone thought it was worthwhile hiring me.
So, I mean, more specifically, do you see the kind of teaching facilities that Warwick has in terms of things like IATL, do you see that as an advantage over other universities such as like Oxford or Cambridge?
Yeah, I do. I mean, one of the things that was difficult in Cambridge was if you wanted to offer anything except a traditional lecture-based course, it was complicated to sort of push through the boundaries. What I was really impressed with here was particularly the Institute for Advanced Teaching and Learning, and I applied to 2 grants for them last year for courses I'm teaching this year, one of which was to create these things that you can see behind me, these sort of replica Greek vases that we use for kind of handling sessions where people actually get to sort of drink from these things and use these things as they would have been done in the Symposium in Ancient Greece, and the other is for the Democracy and Imperialism course, which is intended to sort of turn it towards a much more participatory course throughout the year, and to really encourage students to engage in participation both online and in the classroom, as a continual part of their learning process. And I found that really fascinating, that, you know, here, if you have a good idea, and you say, look, I want to try this, please back me, please support me, the support is there.
I'm sure you found it a learning process in itself, like creating these kind of innovative teaching methods. What kind of challenges have you faced?
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge. I mean, one thing that the Faculty of Arts does here is that each year it runs what they call a teaching and learning showcase. So you go along, and some people are asked to present who have been doing innovative things along the previous year, and they present some of the research that they've done, some of the work that they've done, some of the things they've tried, some things that have worked, some things that haven't worked, and you get to discuss ideas there. So that was a great kind of melting pot to sort of start to formulate ideas, try things out. Someone told me about battle decks there, for instance, like kind of that was the first time I'd really heard of that. So, you know, that's one place that you get ideas from. Then obviously working with IATL, you don't just sort of put an application into them out of the blue. Part of the application process is to go and talk to them and actually sort of discuss your ideas with them about how you want to teach and learn. And then colleagues here in the department, you know, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. This is about things that, you know, work and things that don't work, in terms of working with larger groups or smaller groups, depending on your student numbers, depending on kind of what needs to be done through the course of the year in terms of seminars and assessed essays and exams. So it's sort of bringing the advice and experience from all those different corners together and putting it together, and then trying and seeing what happens. You know, I'm not sure that we've got everything right in this module this year, and it'll be really interesting to hear the student feedback coming back through the SSLC, the Staff Student Liaison Committee, but also through the individual module feedback coming later on in the year. So, you know, I'm open to changes. This is the first time this module's run. I have to do reports back to IATL at the end of the year about what's worked and what hasn't, so, you know, we'll see.
And how did you get into the media and into documentary filmmaking?
Well, I mean, when I finished my PhD, I was pretty sure that I wanted to carry on in academia and started a research fellowship at Cambridge, but I was also pretty sure that I saw it as an important part of what academics should be doing, that is to explain to the wider public why it is that, you know, I'm interested in this topic and why other people might be too. And that's partly because, you know, there is still a certain amount of government funding that comes into universities, i.e. from the taxpayer, you know, that we have a certain obligation to explain what it is we sit here doing all day while we stroke our beards and scratch our heads and read books. But also I think it comes from just, you know, if you love a subject enough to dedicate your life to teaching and learning about it, you should be, I think, excited and want to explain that and communicate that knowledge and interest to other people. And that's what I sort of started off, you know, with the mindset of doing. The question was how to go about doing it. And so since sort of end of PhD onwards, I've been doing lots of things, like I go to schools and give talks to schools, you know, around the country, different classical associations and other types of associations and things like that. And then you can also start to write. I started to write a few pieces for newspapers and online columns. And then I thought, you know, I was teaching a lecture course in Cambridge as part of the research fellowship, and I suddenly realised that there was no easy access book that covered this particular period of history at all, the sort of 4th century BC. Nothing that could allow people who weren't already in the subject to get into it. You know, it was a very complex period. There were lots of books that dealt with it in all its complexity, but nothing that offered that first open door. And so I took a proposal to write a book that would hopefully do that to different publishers, and we got one away, so we wrote that, and that turned into From Democrats to Kings, and that was my first kind of real, if you like, sort of foray into the wider world of public engagement, sort of public intellectualism, if you like, and writing for the wider public. And I loved it. You know, I find it's a very different register to write in. It's a very different set of assumptions you have to make about your reader and what they know and what they don't know and what they're interested in. But actually I find writing and changing your register, so writing something very, very academic, writing something for a lecture for undergrads, writing something for the wider public, really fascinating and refreshing.
Could you tell me more about those kinds of assumptions that you have to engage with and deal with when you're...
Yeah, I mean, the simplest one for when you're writing for the wider public is you can't assume any previous knowledge, right? So, you can't just say, as we all know, the Peloponnesian War was a bad time. Peloponnesian War, whatever, it's war, okay, yeah, right, it's war. But you have to sort of, unthink every assumption of knowledge that you're making. And the second biggest sort of restructuring I think you have to do is you cannot presume that people will be interested in what you've got to say. Students who have elected to spend 3 years studying classics, you can assume that they'll have a certain amount of interest in what you're going to talk about. They've chosen to take the module after all. But the wider public, there is a million and one things that they could be doing with their time. Why should they pick up a book about the ancient Greek or Roman world or whatever it might be? And why is what you're telling them useful and interesting and important for them in their lives? So constantly you have to be keeping those two assumptions front and centre. One, that they don't have any previous knowledge. Two, that you have to demonstrate why they should be interested in what you're saying.
Do you think that pitching proposals to non-academics before you set out on writing a book or starting a TV series, do you find that helpful in terms of...
But I mean, I don't think it's just for pitching for books or TV series. I mean, I think every time you give any kind of talk or lecture to school kids, or it might be to wider associations or the general public, all the way up to pitching for TV documentaries and books and things like that, you have to understand absolutely clearly what it is you want to say, what it is you want to get across, and why people should be interested. That's an interesting intellectual process in itself. Actually drilling down and clarifying what it is that you think about something and what it is important to know about something, why they should be interested in that, I think is a great exercise, and is something that I encourage all the undergrads I teach to do when they're thinking, when they're writing, and it's something which every academic should definitely be doing. I think it can only help the thought and thinking process.
Do you find any other challenges when you're trying to communicate ancient history to in a way that's relevant to us sitting here in 2013?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big problem with history, or the big temptation with history, indeed of any period, is to say, oh, it's just like today, right? And so, lots of people would sort of make an assumption between, say, you can look at this period in ancient history and you can compare it to the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, or, history just keeps on repeating itself, doesn't it? It's so relevant. There's a real danger in making too glibly those associations between the past and the present. The conditions surrounding each particular era and each particular set of decisions are always going to be different. And I think going down that path of saying, oh, it's just like this or it's just like that, that's why history is useful, is a dangerous and not particularly fulfilling one. I think the interest with history is that people have faced many of the same kinds of problems and dilemmas. Democracy and imperialism's an obvious one. How do you balance the rights and responsibilities of individuals within a democratic society? How do you deal with individuals who can talk really well and convince people? How do you deal with people who have natural kind of advantages in terms of education, etc., within a system which is trying to stress the equality of all? These are issues that just keep coming up through societies, through history. And so by looking at what happened in the ancient world in a particular set of examples, and understanding the particular criteria and the particular pressures and advantages that led them to the decisions that they did, can be an illuminating comparison for when we're making the decisions that we make today about how we want our society to function.
How would you frame the distinction between sort of drawing a kind of glib analogy and making those kinds of deeper comparisons? Sure,
I think you put it something simply like this. The Athenian democracy is not the same as modern democracy, right? That would be the kind of glib analogy. Democracy then, democracy now, and lots of people have done that. The 2,500 year anniversary of democracy, right? Kind of that was celebrated, a couple of years ago, and you think, well, hang on, 508 democracy in 508 compared to now, they wouldn't recognise us as democracy, and we wouldn't recognise them as democracy. So that sense of glib analogy doesn't work. But if you were to say, hey, look at how in 508 BC this group of people decided to tackle the issue of aristocratic manipulation and stranglehold on the powerful offices within the Athenian system. Right? That's an interesting comparison for how they've chosen to do it, which you can compare to other historical periods, and you can compare to our ongoing efforts to make sure that the system is fair and equal today.
Do you think that helps us to get over the kinds of us versus them mentalities that we often frequently encounter in contemporary affairs and in ancient history as well?
When you say us, who's us and who's them?
Well, that's part of the question itself.
Well, I think yes and no. On the other hand, one of the problems the ancient world has recently suffered from, and interestingly it goes in cycles with the Olympics when they come up. When the Olympics was in Athens in 2004, the narrative was the ancient world is so similar to ours, right? We and they are the same. Us and them are, there's relatively little difference. Interestingly, when it came around to London for 2012, the narrative, particularly about the Olympics, was do not get carried away with this idea that the Olympics then and now are the same, or that we are the same as them. Actually, there are fundamental differences in the entire way our society is constructed and how it works. And the Olympics is a great example of that. Turn the modern Olympics into the ancient Olympics, and you've got 100 oxen being sacrificed and cooked on a barbecue while the athletes are running naked, while the gods are being worshipped in every possible way, while you've got no sanitation, no drainage, 40,000 people camping out in the August heat, that is, and people are punching each other to death. That's the ancient Olympics, not London 2012, thankfully. So I think, there is a continual seesaw between how much we see them as us and how much we see it as us versus them, and I think that's only right that balance and that debate should continue.
Do you have any advice for anyone who wants to study classics to a high level, maybe sort of undergraduate, postgraduate, and then maybe someone who wants to be like yourself, like an aspiring academic?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the great thing now about most classics departments in the UK is that you do not need any languages before you start, right? That's the kind of the big sea change. And so what you can do is you can come to classics, having done classic or ancient history or history, and say, no, I'm really fascinated in the ancient world. I'd like to learn the languages now, please. And every university department can now take you on that journey. Once you get through it, the issue is about finding out what you're interested in. I mean, life's a fairly short thing, right? And ideally, we all want to be doing jobs where we get to do something that we enjoy. That is, I see the huge privilege of the job I do, right? I get to do a job which focuses on doing something which I really love and which I really enjoy and which I find really fascinating. If that is classics for you, then that will propel you through.
Great. And lastly, just to finish, what's your next project?
So, teaching continues here at Warwick as normal, and we've got a new book. I've got a new book coming out with Princeton University Press in April, which is a sort of big history of Delphi, the centre of the ancient world. So that's coming out. We're just in the middle of a radio show that's going out on Radio 4 called Spin the Globe, which is a kind of new departure for me because it's taking actually dates in history outside of the ancient world, but dates that we all have in our heads from the way things are taught in schools. So dates like 1066 or 1914, and it's saying, okay, we know about one thing that's happening in one part of the world at that moment, but what happens if we spin the globe and find out what else is happening around the world in 1914 or 1066? And the way we've constructed that is that we go to the experts who know about what's happening in India in 1066 or in Korea in around the time of the life of Christ or something like that, and interview them and find out what is going on. So that's been a real journey of discovery and interest for me. And from after that, well, we'll see.
How much research did you have to do for the Spin the Globe series?
Well, I mean, in a way, it's not about me offering anything. It's about me going on a journey and talking to the experts who know about it. So, obviously, we thought about the key dates, and there are 4 episodes in this series. And because the first one was going out near Bonfire Night, we thought 5th of November 1605 would be a good date to start with. then 1066, then 1914, and then we've put one back in the ancient world, which is around the time of the birth of Jesus Christ, so around the 1 BC, 1 AD divide. And those are dates that everyone will know, and everyone's got a fair idea of what was happening on those dates. But first of all, we go and talk to an expert, so a 1066 expert, a 1914 expert, a Life and Times of the Historical Jesus expert, and we just crystallise what it is, what's interesting about that moment. And then, it's a case of basic research to sort of just actually try and work out what else is going on around the world. And when interesting things come up, so for example in 1605, it's the time of troubles over in Russia with the reign of Boris Godunov and the sort of the Poland-Lithuania stroke Russia kind of war that goes on through to 1612. And then we found an expert, locate an expert in that period, and we go and talk to them and we interview them. So the programme is made up pretty much entirely of interviews with different experts, with readings that are from the period. We went to the British Library to have a look at some Chinese texts. We went to the British Museum to look at some images of Shah Abbas I of Persia, who was ruling in 1605. And I can truly say it's been a fantastic journey of discovery for me, and I hope it is for the listeners as well.
And do you find that satisfying, illuminating parts of history that have sort of vanished from trace?
Yeah, no, I think it is actually. I think it is a really fascinating and interesting way of doing history, because the way history is taught in schools, the way academics departments work, the way university undergraduate and postgraduate study works, is that you get very focused on your speciality. And I may know what is happening for an immense range of time, but I'll know about it in a very particular geographical region, the Mediterranean and the classical Greek and Roman worlds. Fine, that's great. But there's another way of doing history which says, hang on, what about if we try and get a better sense of global history, of the relative developments of different worlds, of different continents, of different empires? What if we get a sense of kind of actually how our global history, our human story at a bigger level has evolved and developed? And that's very hard to do, because where are the history books that that do that for you, that open that world up for you? And it has been interesting that it's been quite a challenge on the one hand to find out what's going on around the world at particular points in time. But when we have, and when we've gone to talk to the experts and said, hey, would you come and do an interview for this programme? This is the idea behind this programme. They've all absolutely leapt at it, and they've all got the idea, and they've all loved the idea. And so I think there's not only one way to skin a cat, there's not only one way to teach or learn history, but I think an approach, the traditional method where you get very specific in a particular geographical region, or you get very specific in a particular era, great. But I think there's a room for another way of doing history, which is this sense of global context and connection.
Do you think that's political in a sense, in that you're kind of giving a voice to, or legitimating narratives that are alternative from the received?
Well, it's political in a sense that I think the reason we have history taught the way we do is that there's a very nationalist principle to history. In schools you learn English history here, not exclusively, but you most often learn about periods of history which in some way have impacted on us and our world. So I think in prioritising that sense of global context and connection, you are breaking out of national historical kind of genres. And that can only be a good thing, I think, in the globalised world in which we're now living, where everyone really does need to know what is happening in China, or in Russia, or in Brazil, or India, kind of thing. So I think it's only a positive thing. In terms of sort of other terms of politics, is it sort of offering a different manifesto for how we study history? Yes, to a certain extent, but I don't believe that my manifesto for studying history, or this manifesto for studying history, is any more or less important than other ways of doing it. I just think there should be space for more than one.
Great. So I've been talking to Michael Scott here at Warwick. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.